My name is Kelly McGrath, and I am here today to do a little presentation of the products made by R&F Handmade Paints. So just to give a little introduction to my background, I have been working with encaustic materials for about 10 years now. I started working at R&F in 2009 in their post-production area. And then I began teaching classes there, and eventually I was the coordinator for their education program. So I've had a really a lot of great opportunities to work with this material, to work with artists that are working with this material in a lot of different capacities. And today I want to show you a few basic techniques, like how to get started with it, what tools you need to work with it, and what a safe setup either at home or in a studio is. So currently, the location that I am demonstrating at is actually SUNY New Paltz. I am the studio technician for the sculpture department. So I just want to point out that behind me I have a lot of really well built-in ventilation. For the purpose of this demonstration, I am not working directly under the ventilation hoods, but ideally, when you are working with encaustic paint, one of the things that you really want to be aware of is proper ventilation. It's not that this material is inherently toxic, but it can be irritating to heat wax and have wax fume in an enclosed space. So one of the first things that you want to make sure of when you're setting up to work with encaustic is that you have a space that has fresh air circulating in it. One of the easiest ways to set up ventilation, especially in a home situation, is to actually have a box fan and to work directly under a window that you can put that box fan into, face it backwards, and that will draw out any wax fume that you might be working with. So I just want to talk quickly about the setup that I have here. I am working today with the 16 by 16 anodized aluminum palette that's made by R&F. I have a number of brushes set up on this palette. So when you're getting ready to set up your workspace, one of the things that's very important is the brushes that you're working with will need to be heated as you're working. Otherwise, I'm just going to grab an example of a brush that's cooled. And these are just a few examples of brushes that you can work with really nicely. These are hake brushes. They have really nice, dense, soft bristles. They're a goat hair brush. So this is a brush that has not had any encaustic wax put into it. It's really nice and pliable and soft still. This is a brush that has cooled encaustic wax in it. It's really stiff. The bristles are no longer pliable. But the way to reactivate this is to simply place it on the palette. And if you can all see this brush here, I'm just going to bring it over. My hands are very desensitized to heat, so I don't advise that you do this, but this is just to show how the bristles become nice and pliable again once they have sat on the heated surface and are ready to be used again. So another tool that I have that I'm gonna try and push my second camera here up for just a moment. When I'm working with encaustic medium, I tend to like to have a lot of it available for me to prepare a surface and also to mix into my colors to extend them. So what I have here is just an electric brittle, a covered electric brittle. And I like working with this. You can get them in all kinds of sizes. This is a rather large one. My preferred size is closer to either 12 by 12 or 16 by 16, like my palette, just to save on space with my work area. What I like about this is that it's a lidded container so that I can warm up my encaustic medium but not overheat it. So the thing with encaustic medium, and I'm just going to show a little close-up of this. This is encaustic medium. This is the base material for all of the encaustic colored paints. And the basic recipe is a combination of filtered white beeswax and damar resin. The damar resin is a really interesting material. It raises the melting point of white beeswax, and it also gives it a much harder surface finish so that you can do things like buff and carve and really work into the surface without it being too soft. So that's what I have melted in this container here, and I have a small container of it on my palette, and I'm just going to pick this up so that everybody can see what it looks like melted. It looks very clear. It's deceptively clear when it is completely liquefied like this, and I'll speak more to that in just a minute.
So you just had a question asking what kind of resin or
It's white beeswax, filtered white beeswax, and damar resin. Those are both materials that R&F produces as just a bulk raw material. And you can buy the encaustic medium. It comes in 1 pound bags like this. It comes in solid blocks like this. When it comes in the packaged bags, it'll be in a pelletized form, which is really nice because it melts very quickly onto either the palette surface or in another type of container that you might be heating it up in. Okay, so then the rest of my palette setup, I have divided several colors, the palette that I'm going to be working with today, into these little metal containers. You don't have to do this. I tend to like to do that just when I'm trying to keep my workspace very organized. But what's great about the palette, and I'm not sure, can the side camera see this, Aaron? Yeah. So what's great about the palette is that you can just melt your colors directly onto the surface and use this to mix as well as just activate the paint. So say I had 2 colors that I wanted to combine. This is Provence blue, and then I'm going to actually mix in a little bit of titanium white just to make this an even paler version of the color. So I'm melting both colors right onto the surface. And then I can just go in, that brush is it's got a little bit of stuff on it, so I'll use a more neutral brush. And I can go and mix a nice color in between right on the palette and then use this to paint with. So one of the other attributes of the encaustic medium is that I use it as a base material. I will treat the surface of my painting with this, and I'll demonstrate that in just a moment. But we also use this to extend the colors. So the colors in the R&F line are really, really highly pigmented. They're almost over-pigmented to the point where the cups that I have in front of me, I fill about 1/4 to 1/3 of the way with actual color. And then I will put another 1/3 of that cup filled with encaustic medium. So I'm going to actually just mix a little bit of medium into my Provence blue right here.
So you have a question asking about alternatives to beeswax. Is there another product or natural beeswax from a hive?
You can use natural beeswax from a hive, that's fine. The only difference between a raw beeswax and the filtered beeswax is that it will most likely be much more yellow when you go to mix it with the Damar resin. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. What may happen is more neutral colors that you're working with, like the titanium white or any of the pale colors, they may show that level of yellowing more drastically than our encaustic medium that's a more neutral sort of hue. But yeah, that's why R&F actually has these materials available as separate raw materials, because, you know, we invite artists to experiment with wax combinations that work for the specific applications that they're trying to do. Okay, so a few more things about safety. The surface temperature of my palette is never going to go above 200 degrees. 220 degrees is the max temperature that you should heat this material to. But at 200 degrees, the wax is completely liquefied. It's not going to enhance its fluidity or really do anything to benefit the material to heat it over 200 degrees. And for the encaustic medium, you want to be really cautious about that. And that's another reason why I like the electric griddle, because you can control the temperature on it really specifically. The one that I'm working with, the lowest actual number setting is 275 degrees, but I know that at the warm setting, I can double check it with a thermometer. And I recommend a surface thermometer because it will actually touch the bottom of the surface and tell you specifically what that temperature is. The encaustic medium can become discolored if it is overheated or if it's heated for a prolonged amount of time. So when you're working in your studio, my advice, you know, one of the reasons I like having one of these, again, is because it's a very large surface area and it will melt your medium very quickly and make it accessible for you to use really quickly. But then when you're done using it for the time being, you can always unplug that and let it cool back off. Or you can set it to a very low temperature, and what will happen, I'll just show one of these cups because it's sort of happening. You'll get a little bit of a film at the top where you can see that the wax is slightly cooler. And that's absolutely fine. That's actually better for the prolonged heating of your wax, the medium in this electric skillet, to allow it to just cool a little bit at the top and cloud back over, because then you know that you're not overheating it. If it's just liquid, eventually what you'll see is a yellowing that, again, it's not the end of the world. You can still use the material, but it's going to become less neutral depending on the colors that you're working with and the type of layering that you're doing and that sort of thing. So that is just my recommendation for working with the medium if you're going to work with a lot of it. Otherwise, just having a small container of it while you're painting and using that for mixing, probably acceptable too. So the encaustic medium is a great way to start a base layer for paintings that you're working on. And before I actually get into layering with that, I want to talk about the surfaces real quick that I'm going to be working on today. So one of the surfaces is encaustic board, which is a product produced by Ampersand. And we're going to provide a link to that in the chat. Oh, and I forgot to mention in the beginning, we're also providing a link to the email list for R&F because they have a lot of great virtual and in-person events. I believe they'll be restarting in-person events sometime next May. But they have a lot of great virtual demos that they offer, and they send out a really great newsletter. So I really recommend that everybody sign up for that. And if you enjoy this demo and you potentially would like to work with me as an instructor, I'm also providing a link to my email list as well. Don't feel compelled to sign up for it, but I always love to get new students. And as we're going through the demo, if anybody has questions about specific products, we have a few that we're already going to be included in the chat, but we'll try to update the chat as we're going and just provide a direct link to any of that information so that you have that available. All right, so getting back to my working surfaces, what the encaustic board is a hardboard panel that has been pre-gessoed with encaustic gesso. So encaustic gesso is a highly absorbent gesso. It has a much grittier tooth than a standard acrylic gesso does. And acrylic gesso does not work well with encaustic. Acrylic paint in general creates this really impervious barrier for encaustic. And encaustic likes to be on an absorbent surface. So encaustic medium works well. I also have a panel that is just a, this is just a pine panel that I picked up, I think, at, really inexpensively. I think there's a company called Artex that does them. And ampersand also has unprimed pine panels as well. And I'm just going to show a close-up in the close-up camera here. I have a little bit of stuff on each of these panels, but you can see really clearly that the unprimed panel, you can see the hue of the wood surface through the encaustic medium. So the base layer on here, aside from all of the other surface techniques that I've done, this is wood that you're seeing through a few layers of encaustic medium. So it's not quite as neutral as working on an encaustic board panel, which will just give you a very neutral white surface. And a white surface is really nice, especially for the translucent colors, because this will really bounce light back through them if translucency is something that you're really playing around with. Okay, so I just want to show the way that I will typically prepare a panel. This is the panel that I'm going to be working on. It has been recycled several times. You can see some of the embedded marks that are still on there. But what encaustic medium will do, you can see that a little bit of color has bled through, but for the most part, this is a pretty neutral surface for me to begin working on. The first step that I want to take here is I'm going to be heating this up with a heat gun. So this red heat gun is one that R&F carries. This also comes in several kits that they offer. If you're ready to run out right now and get started immediately working with encaustic, R&F has several starter kits that include both the palette and the heat gun. They're really nice kits. They're very comprehensively put together. But if you already have a little bit of a setup and you need a few individual items, these are also available outside the kit as well. So what I want to do is make my surface nice and warm before I put wax on. Now, in terms of settings on your heat gun, there is a low fan speed and a high fan speed. You can hear the difference pretty clearly, and they're both marked on the handle of the gun. And then this is a variable temperature heat gun. So you can see the scale for the temperature. They're not very precise with individual temperatures because this is really just a slider on the back here. But you can work within a range of low to high. So my settings for the heat gun, I'm going to be working on the highest temperature range. For the most part, I will use the low fan speed, and you'll see that when I start to fuse a little bit. But just to prepare my panel and get it nice and warm for painting on, I'm going to start on high fan speed. And it doesn't take a lot of time to get this warmed up. I have also seen artists put their panels over the top of their palette to heat it up, over the top of an electric griddle. You just want to make sure that that surface is very warm, because a warm surface will allow the wax to sink into the pores of either the encaustic medium or the wood much more easily than a cold surface. Wax doesn't really like to go from a warm setting to a cold setting. That can really shock the material and give you issues right in your base layers with adhesion. So it's a really, really important thing to heat your panel up before you start painting it. Then the way that I start with preparing my panels, I usually have a wider hake brush, and I'll paint anywhere from about 6 to 8 layers of encaustic medium on here. And what I like to do, can you see me in the frame still? Yeah. Am I a little bit out? Okay. I'm going to bring it back over here. And I'll work out of my little tiny container here. So again, I like to use the hake brush for this. This one is the hake brush. This one is the hake brush. So right now I'm using a 4-inch wide hake brush. And I'm not doing any fusing at the moment because my surface is nice and warm, my wax is nice and warm. So I'm not really concerned about adhesion between these immediate few layers, but I will be fusing as I start to add color and more design to my surface. So right now, my surface is still pretty highly textured from my brush strokes. And you can still see some of the leftover surface elements from my previous paintings, but they're starting to get a little bit cloudier. So that's one of the things that happens with the encaustic medium, is you will you'll begin to lose detail and clarity if you have something underneath your surface and you're working over the top of it. So that's important to know, especially if you're working with photographic imagery or graphic imagery and you're layering on top. Okay. So you can see that this is a really highly textured surface. And now I want to fuse this. And by fusing, what I mean is that we're going to heat the surface to the point where the wax is going to start to melt together. So you can see a lot of that texture starting to melt down. You can see a few little air bubbles rising to the surface. And as I'm working with the heat gun, I do have this on the low fan speed. And I'm continually moving the heat around the surface. So the maximum temperature that these heat guns get up to is about 1200 degrees. It's very, very hot. If you leave your heat gun in one spot for too long, I'm going to do that purposefully right here, you're going to get a big dimple in your painting. We usually call that a hot spot. You can reclaim the surface from that, but you have to let that space cool down really thoroughly And then you can go back in and fill it with encaustic medium. The other thing that can happen with a hot spot, especially if you're working in an unair conditioned area like I am, is it can cause a heat feedback with your heat gun. And as a safety feature, your heat gun has a little sensor inside it that if you're concentrating too much heat around the nozzle, it will shut itself off. That does not mean that your heat gun is broken. It just means that you have to give it a little bit of time to cool off. And that is what's happening with it right now. So I'm going to go to my backup heat gun. So any heat gun that has the variable speed and temperature range, you can use with encaustic. You cannot use a hairdryer. And I don't recommend using a heat gun that does not have at least the variable speed, because most heat guns that don't have that are really made for like stripping paint and doing things like that, where you really want an aggressive, fast-moving heat source, and you don't want that for your encaustic. So what I'm doing right now is just getting my surface nice and level. And for the sake of just showing you a little bit of variety in the tools that you can use, I'm also going to do a quick torch fuse on this surface. When I am working with this material, I like to have a little bit of a variety in the fusing tools that I have. So I usually have a torch handy, even if I'm using my heat gun. The torch that I'm using here is called a wall length LPT 500, and we have a link for that in the chat. It is a refillable butane torch. So I have a little canister of butane here, and you just, this is what the bottom looks like where you actually fill the butane. And I'm just gonna push this into the bottom, and I will hear the gas flowing in. And you want to do this right next to your ventilation. I'm not doing it now just for the purpose of demonstrating how to do the filling, but butane is not good for you to breathe in, so you want to do this right next to your vent with whatever ventilation you're using. So now that I have my torch all loaded up with gas, I'm going to turn it on. And the reason I like the wall length is because I get a flame size that is a little bit smaller than something like an Iwatani torch. If you're familiar with torch fusing in encaustic, the Iwatani has been very popular for a long time as a torch. And I have no problem with those. I just tend to like how this one handles a little bit better because the butane is inside the torch instead of having a removable top the way the Iwatani has. So I'm just very lightly going over the surface. There are two settings on your torch for the flame. When your flame is oxygenated, it's going to be really tight and it's going to sound like the gas is flowing a little more aggressively. I don't use that setting. I close the little oxygen valves on the torch itself so that I have a very light feathery flame. And then I'm actually going to turn the gas down on this a little bit because I want the smallest possible flame that I can get. Maybe not the smallest, but a step up from the smallest. Because the flame is a really highly concentrated amount of heat. And especially if you're working with a really detailed surface, you can, that fusing puddle in the wax can get away from you very quickly. So I'm just going to use this to finish evening out my surface. And right now, I have a really high, glossy, glistening look to the wax. That tells me that it's really still liquid and not ready to be painted on. So I'm gonna just give this a moment to cool off. Blow on it. And I'm gonna move this aside for just a moment. And I just wanna talk about if you're interested in working over a collaged surface. Now this is a panel that does have a very, very thin layer of wax on it. I'm not sure if you can see the shine from the wax. And by thin, I mean like millimeters thick. And the way that I did that, I'm gonna clean off my palette really quick. I'm just gonna give myself a little working corner here. And I'm just gonna mention at this point another tool that I really love working with when I'm trying to keep my palette clean and organized. This is the Catalyst Wedge tool. We have a link for that in the chat. And I love using this because it's a silicone tool. It can't be damaged by heat. And it's just really nice for moving material around the palette surface and kind of giving you a little clean space. Now I have a lot of good paint right here. I'm going to try and not lose that, so I'm going to push it over to the side. And one of the challenges with the palette is making sure that it is level. So when you get the 16 by 16 palette, if you decide that you want to work with that as your heated surface, just know that the legs are adjustable so that, you know, depending on maybe your table or your counter is a little bit out of level, it allows you to adjust the level of the palette to whatever your working surface is. Okay, so if I have, so I'm just going to do a quick little demonstration of what happens when you have too much encaustic medium built up onto a surface. So I'm just going to go ahead and add a few layers over the top of this collage paper. So that was about 5 or 6 layers of wax that I added on there. And you can see a really drastic difference between a very thin layer of encaustic medium and the amount of encaustic medium that I put onto my other panel to prepare it as a surface for working deeper layers into. So one of the easiest ways to reclaim this surface is to plunk it right down on top of your palette and just let all that extra material melt off. So what's great about this is you're going to be left with a very, very thin layer of encaustic medium. So you'll have that nice waxed finish, but it will be very, very thin. So this is the way that I recommend, especially, again, if you're working with photographic imagery or you're working with graphic imagery, learning how to keep your layers extremely thin, like in the millimeters, is a really good methodology to begin to work with. And I should just mention at this point, so the paper that I have on this surface, I actually glued that down ahead of time. If you're working with an entire background that is either paper or some other collage material like fabrics are really great for background surfaces on encaustic. I recommend that you glue it down to your surface first. And this is the glue that I like to use. It's made by Limeco. It's just neutral adhesive, neutral pH adhesive. You know, does not have any acid in it. Is archivally sound. Yeah, I have found that this is a really nice, very strong adhesive that does not interfere with the wax itself as you're layering on top of it. And we have a link in the chat for that. I don't know if I introduced everyone to my assistant Erin, but she's amazing. She's helping me here today. She's our chat guru. Okay, so let's say in the inevitable case that you have already waxed your surface, but you still want to work with a collage paper on top of it. You can still do that. So at the moment, I've had a few pieces of paper sitting in my wax vat. What's great about papers and fabrics is you can pre-wax them. You can just stick them in your vat, or you can put them right onto the palette surface. And once they are fully saturated with the wax, they're just stable like that. They can't get oversaturated unless it's, and even if it's an extremely delicate paper like a tissue paper, it should not fall apart on you. The one paper that I have had the experience of having flake apart is if you're working with antique papers or you're working with like very old papers. Sometimes I'll get like old books and things that I'll rip pages out of and use as collage. Those can tend to fall apart, so you should wait until you're absolutely ready to use it to put the wax inside. So I've got that all waxed. I have wax on this encaustic board panel already. So my next step is I'm going to just lightly heat this up. I want to heat this to the point where my wax is nice and sticky. So what I'm looking for is just a really light glisten on that wax surface. I don't want to completely liquefy this. And again, I'm only holding the panel in my hand like this to demonstrate the fusing, but don't make this a regular practice because I don't want anybody to get burned with their heat gun. I'm going to set it aside. So now, I'm going to take my little piece of paper that has just been very thinly waxed, and I'm doing exactly what I did on this panel. This paper is now fully saturated with just the thinnest possible amount of encaustic medium, and I want to do this while the paper is warm because that will just help tack it down. So I'm going to take it and I'm going to move directly onto my wax surface. And again, this is where the catalyst tool becomes really, really handy, as long as it's clean. And you don't have to rush this. The wax isn't going anywhere and it can always be reactivated. So this has cooled a little bit at this point. It's still a little bit warm to the touch. We're not completely fused down though because I could still pull this off. It's really only lightly tacked on there. So my next step is to throw some more heat back onto it. Okay. And then I'm going to use my catalyst tool. And this is like no pressure whatsoever. This is just very, very lightly because I have a layer of medium underneath and I don't want to put any dents or any texture into that. Oh, and in case anybody is wondering about this, I recommend parchment paper as a working surface. It is completely non-stick for the wax, and it's really great for reclaiming your wax. So say that you have been working with a whole lot of colors, or a whole lot of medium and you have a bunch of it dripped around the edge. I'm gonna let that cool off, and then in a minute I'll be able to peel it back off and stick it back in my cup and continue to use it. So I'm gonna let this cool for just a few minutes, and I'm actually gonna put one quick layer of encaustic medium right over the top. And we'll come back to this. I'm gonna set this aside for a few minutes and let it cool. And then we'll finish cleaning that up and get it to look as nice as this one. So, the next thing I want to introduce are the colors, which is what this is really all about, because R&F has such a beautiful wide range of colors. I'm just gonna do a little close-up of this on the big camera. So the R&F line is incredibly extensive with the number of colors they have. I forget what number we're up to now. It's in the hundreds. It's like 100, maybe 107. I think we're past that though. It used to be 105. And now we're well beyond that. So if you are working in your studio and you are trying to organize your color library, or you're just trying to figure out what paints you want to order, I recommend getting a copy of the R&F color chart. They have a digital copy, and then you can also get a hand-painted color chart, which actually has individual hand-painted chips. It's a really great reference tool because then you actually see the consistency of the color, especially if you like working with the translucent colors. It gives you a much better sense of what those translucent layers look like. And I just want to point out on the back side of the color chart, this is a really useful reference tool because R&F has designated their colors into categories of opaque, translucent, and semi-translucent. And then for the pigment sticks, which are both featured on one color chart, excuse me, they also have indicators for drying time. So they've designated them as fast, medium, slow, and very slow because the very rich oil paints that R&F make can tend to have longer extended drying times than other tube oil paints, which can work really well in some applications and be really an interesting challenge in other areas. And we'll look at the pigment sticks in just a few minutes, but I want to just get started with layering a few colors onto this panel. So what's great about this panel is because I just fused it, it's nice and warm. If you have allowed a panel to sit for a few minutes, say I wanted to work on this one that is sitting behind me, I would want to very lightly heat this up before I start working with it. Not to the point where you liquefy the surface, but just to the point where that wax is warm and sticky and ready to adhere to the layer that you're putting on top of it. So, R&F has, as I mentioned, R&F has a great range of colors. I'm going to start with just a few of the opaque colors. So what we have right here is cadmium yellow medium. Really beautiful, really dense color. And I just want to reiterate that when I am preparing colors to work with, I do extend them with encaustic medium. So this has been extended with encaustic medium by about 50%, and I'm still getting a really dense, solid color there. So I've gone ahead and I put on one stroke. I do want to fuse this in. So now we're getting to the point where we're going to start composing a painting. And this is where fusing becomes really important because you want good adhesion between your layers. So wax is a really interesting material to paint with because it's very, it's physically much denser than something like an acrylic, certainly much denser than a watercolor. So you sort of have to think of your layering in a very physical sense. So I literally put a thick layer of material on top of another layer. So I want to make sure that I fuse them together. And again, you'll notice that I'm keeping my heat gun moving. And what I'm looking for I'm not sure if this is going to translate well, but right here is where I've just fused. It's nice and smooth. And right here is where I painted. I have a lot of brushstroke texture. And for my purpose right now, for just a general basic fuse, I want to sort of get rid of that texture as my goal. So I'm just watching for the surface to level out. And you can see in some of these areas that the paint will really start to spread and move together. All right, I want to add a few more layers on here now. So I'm going to put a few more opaque colors on. This one is cadmium red deep. The other thing that encaustic medium will do is it'll add fluidity to your colors. So I find that when I'm just working with the straight color, it's often very thick, and it will still lay down nicely, but the encaustic medium tends to add fluidity to my brush stroke so that I have less of these areas that where the color has broken up a little bit. Which is, you know, important as you're painting with it. And, you know, you can certainly play around with all of this texture. Right now I'm working in a very smooth way. In a minute, I'll show you a few fun ways to play around with texture. So the next color that I'm going to put on here is ultramarine blue pale. And the other thing that you might notice is that I don't have a lot of blending going on directly on my painted surface. So this is another big difference between a material like encaustic paint and something like acrylic paint or even watercolor. I'm not going to get a lot of mixing of colors directly on my painted surface. That really happens on the palette and is then applied to your surface. So I'm going to give that a quick fuse. How are we doing on time? How are we doing on time?
It's 5 to 2. But that color you just put on really looks like white.
Oh, okay.
So you have like half an hour left.
And we're going to pack that half hour full of a lot of information. So if everyone can see on there, I've got a nice little rainbow of colors going on. So now I want to play around with some of our translucent colors. So what's great about the translucent colors is you can really do some very interesting things with layering with them. Not that you can't do that with the opaque colors, but the translucent colors have a unique quality that in the pigment itself that actually allows them to be used in that way. So I'm just going to clear a little spot here on the corner of my palette so I can really make sure that I've got a nice translucent color. You can make your translucent colors more opaque by building layers of them, but what I want to do right now is actually just really work with that nice translucent quality. So the first color I'm going to work with here is Indian Yellow. It is the most translucent color in both the encaustic and pigment stick lines. Just wipe off the brush here. This will tend to happen on the ferrules of your brush as you'll get a lot of wax congealed on there after a while. So you just have to heat that up, scrape it off, let it fall into your container. It's all very useful wax. So as much as you can hang on to this wax, you know, be it parchment paper or in cups, you can even recycle it onto pieces of aluminum foil and heat those back up on your palette to use again. Don't let that good wax go to waste. Okay. So again, a nice warm surface. And I'm going to add actually a little bit more encaustic medium to this because I'm not getting quite the level of fluidity that I want. Okay. So you can really see that translucent quality where I can see the layers of my other colors underneath the Indian Yellow. And we're getting a little bit of optical mixing, but again, the colors are staying very independent of one another. So if I wanted to really achieve like a nice green by blending the Indian Yellow over the ultramarine blue pale, I would probably want to actually mix that on my palette and then paint it different surface. So I'm going to give that a quick fuse. Just to get rid of that texture. Okay. Now I'm going to add in my other two translucent colors. This is alizarin crimson. It's really highly concentrated, so it'll make them out rather opaque. Yep, that is coming out really quite opaque. So I'm going to, again, clean off a little bit of space on my palette. And I'm going to add a lot of encaustic medium into that. And really try to encourage that translucent quality to come out. And then we're going to go ahead and add one more layer. This color that I'm going to add is a personal favorite. It's Prussian blue, which was only introduced very recently to the R&F encaustic line. They've had it in their pigment stick line for many, many years, but they just recently, in the last few years, added it to the encaustic colors. And it is such a brilliant color to work with. And again, really, really highly concentrated. So I really have to cut that a lot with encaustic medium. And I really highly encourage everyone to just be very playful with all of these colors and very experimental, and especially if you're first starting out with encaustic. There are quite a few technical aspects of this material to get used to, such as having to heat your material rather than working with something that is fluid and then dries. You're working with hot and cold. And that is a whole range of technical feats to kind of overcome if you're used to painting with other materials. So I just want to point out this really beautiful jewelry quality that we got with the Prussian blue. Very nice optical mixing of the two colors. My alizarin crimson was a little bit denser, but you can see here in the encaustic medium just that nice translucent quality and the light bouncing through the color. It's just a really fun thing to play around with. Okay, so we've done some great stuff with just a nice, flat, neutral surface. This is very basic. So now I want to add in playing around with a little bit of texture. And we're going to actually combine that with doing a little bit of stenciling, because that's another really fun technique that you can use with encaustic. So, as I mentioned before, this panel is really cool to the touch. So I want to just wake it up. I'm going to use my high fan speed to do that. All right, we've got a nice awakened surface. I'm going to put 2 layers of encaustic medium right over the top of that. Just to give myself a nice, smooth working surface. Even though we're going to work with texture, I really like to start with a smooth surface. It's a compulsion of mine. It's a compulsion of many people who work with encaustic after a while. And I'm going to turn that down to the low fan speed, because warm wax onto warm surface equals a lot of fluidity and very little texture to begin with. So I just want to remove some of that brushstroke texture, and then we're going to add in a whole bunch of other textures.
So Kelly, you have a question asking of any good books to understand encaustic further?
Lots of really good books out there. Will I remember them off the top of my head? You know, R&F may have a list of them on their resources page. We used to do that. They may not have them anymore. The short answer is yes. The long answer is I may have to provide that in a follow-up email that I can send to Andrew and then he can send out to everyone. But there are a lot of great technique books out there. And I will rack my brains and try to remember the names of a few of the authors to try and tell you by the end of the demo. Okay, so we have a relatively warm working surface here, which is good for building texture, even though we're going to be working very cool at this point. Because again, you want your layers to adhere together. You don't want too much texture, or you don't want too much heat, because then you won't build texture, but you need a little for that initial adherence. So I've got a warm surface, I've got a very warm brush here with a lot of medium in it, and I'm letting this brush cool. So notice that I didn't put it on right away. And now I'm going to very lightly start to just brush a little bit onto this surface. And I'm going to just vary the direction lightly. You don't have to use medium to start your base color or your base texture. I'm just doing that out of convenience. because this is a nice thick brush that I have to work with. So I'm just doing this very, I'm not trying to build the texture in a specific direction or in a specific shape at the moment. I'm just generally allowing texture to accumulate on my surface. I'm not sure if that translates very well, but it will in a minute when I start adding color in there. All right, so let's use some of this luscious Prussian blue. And this is really going to pick up the look of all of that texture that I was putting in here. So again, just brushing, allowing the brush to cool. Brushing very lightly. This is a very basic way of starting to play with texture. And I'm going to keep going in the same direction for a couple of layers. And you're going to really see an accumulation in the specific direction that I'm brushing in. So this method is typically referred to as accretion, with good reason. I also found out that that is an astrological, geological term for the same thing. It's just materials that are glomming together, basically. That's the really layman way of saying that. So we've got a little bit of Prussian on there, and we've also got a little bit of the ultramarine blue pale. And I'm going to add another layer of the Prussian, and that's going to really start to pop that texture. So again, I'm just working very lightly. Notice that I haven't fused in between any of these layers. One of the reasons being that fusing will reduce all of this texture very quickly because it's not built up in a very, it's not built up very thick yet. The other reason is that I'm working pretty immediately more material onto one material. So I have a little bit of fusing naturally going on with just the friction of building those layers. And I find that alternating, especially contrasting, contrasting colors like the very dark Prussian and the very light ultramarine will really exaggerate the quality of how textural the surface is. Okay, so now you can really see a very nice accumulation is happening here. Is that pretty visible here? So at this point, if I like this look, what I would do is a quick little fuse, just a very, very light fuse. And some of this is going to clump together a little tighter, and some of it is going to flatten out. And actually, I want to show this close up so you can really see what happens as you're heating this. And you can even really reduce this and let it huddle together a lot. That's not really the look that, for the most part, you want to go for when you're doing accretion. But now you can see that it's the little tiny parts are beating up. So that's about as much fusing as I would want to do on that to maintain that texture. It's pretty important to know that this texture is very fragile because it's not very highly fused. And the wax itself, especially depending on environmental conditions, can get a little bit brittle. So just know that accretion like this is fragile in case you're sending this piece to show somewhere where you have to ship it, or it has to be handled in any way. And you know, I usually don't use a lot of accretion texture like this, but something like this. Let's see if I can show it on here. Yeah, so just know that that's a very fragile surface. You can do things when you're storing them and shipping them to protect this. Even just putting, placing your panel in something like a shadow box is a good way to protect that surface. Just be prepared that that is the reality of working with high texture like that. So the next thing I want to show is a little bit of stenciling, and we're going to come back to this panel again. And I want to, actually, no, we're going to go forward with that. So the simplest way to create a stencil is just with a little bit of blue painter's tape or other masking tape. You want to try and use a low tack tape, and you want your surface to be a little bit cool. So I'm just going to throw the tape down there. Oh, we're going to fit a lot into that 15. And I'm going to use one of my bigger brushes to just fill this space. All right, so I got the tape down. I don't want to really press this down because I don't want to risk delaminating my wax. So I'm just making sure, I'm just running my finger over the edge to make sure that there are no air bubbles there. And then I'm going to paint right over the surface, right over the edge. I recommend painting in from the edge of the tape. And the warmer that your brush is and the warmer that your surface is, the less you're going to get a lot of textured brush stroke and then have to go back and fuse that smooth. So right now we're working with a smooth stencil. That's the goal here. I'm going to just very lightly fuse this with the heat gun, only to take out some of the brush stroke texture. So I'm really watching that wax. And as soon as I have gotten a little bit of liquefaction, I'm going to take the heat away, because I don't want the wax to creep under the edge of the tape. That would defeat the purpose of creating a stencil in the first place. So just really light fuse, light. Take that heat. I wait until all of that puddle and glisten is gone, and then remove my stencil. So now I have a lot of nice, clean edges on that stencil to work with. You can use that tape too. I shouldn't have just crumbled it up like that. You can keep the tape going for a little bit. It will build up a lot of wax on it, but as long as it's still adherent to the surface, you can keep using it, just in the sense of not being wasteful on materials. So the next step I want to do here is I want to protect that edge. That's one of the trickiest things with working with stencils, is making sure that your edges stay really clean. I'm going to see if I can get this to look right on the camera. If you look very closely, you can see that layer of white sitting on top of the other colors. Like there is a real differentiation between this layer and this layer. So if I go to fuse this, say I go to fuse in this corner, it never does it when I want it to do it. It's really likely that that edge will collapse, there we go, and start to bleed and run and not stay nice and crisp the way you intend it to. So the way that you protect your edges is we're actually going to put the light layer of encaustic medium. This is going to look a little heavy-handed at first, but we are actually going to go back and scrape that. And this will basically provide, you know, just a little bit of material along the edge so that you're kind of scaffolding that edge with a little bit of encaustic. All right, we're gonna let that cool off and then we're gonna give it a little scrape. And while we're waiting for that, we're gonna go back to our textured panel and do another stencil, but we'll be putting texture into this one. So this is just a Mylar stencil. You know, they're cheap and easy to find almost everywhere. And they're okay for working with wax. This will degrade pretty significantly over time. But for the purpose of just, you know, doing a little design element in my surface, you know, the Mylar stencils I have found, you can get anywhere from, if you're really delicate with them, you can use them for a while, but after layering the wax like this, they usually degrade after like maybe 5 or 6 uses, if that. There are other materials that are a little bit stronger if you like the idea of making your own stencil. This is just a hand stencil. These are both homemade stencils, and I used a material called Duralar to make these, and we will provide a link for that. So I'm just gonna paint in over my textured area that Duralar stencil. Duralar comes clear and frosted. I tend to like the frosted one because it's easier to see it. And if it's not tacked down, I recommend doing a little bit of double-sided tape just to keep that tacked down a little bit better. The wax will usually tack it down pretty naturally, but if you find that it's popping, a little bit of double-sided tape along the edges will keep it layered down a little bit better. And again, I'm painting away from the edges into the center as much as I can. Especially over the texture, because the wax will really want to, since it's not evenly laid down on the surface, the wax will really want to creep under the edges. So we've got a fun little bunny there. And this one, we're gonna put in a little bit more texture before we pull it. That white was a little bit thick. I'm doing on time, Erin. 10 minutes. 10 minutes, we can do this. We can fit so much more into this demo. Oh my goodness. We're gonna do a transfer next. It's gonna be great. Okay, so we've got a little bit of texture layered in there. So that came out pretty nice. I had a little bit of bleeding under the edge. You know, for a stencil that's this intricate, I'm pretty satisfied with the how limited that bleeding was. And I can do a couple of different things with this. For one, I could seal it with a layer of medium. So we'll do that on this half. Oop. And that was a little warm, so we got a little bleeding there. I'm gonna let that settle for just a moment. And on the other side, we're gonna put a color, a solid color over the top of this. So we're gonna put a solid opaque layer of the ultramarine blue pale. And I've got a nice, soft pocket brush for doing this. I find that especially when you're trying to really build up a solid layer of color, the hockey brushes just hold the color a lot more evenly. The other thing that I want to note about this is the edges of your palette are going to be the coolest areas of your palette. So this is already sitting a little bit thicker in my brush and laying down a lot thicker onto my surface. So I think you can really see how thick that texture is looking, how thick those layers are. And I'm going to just even this out a little bit along the edge. It's still very warm, but I'm going to go ahead and cover it with a little more medium anyway. Did not let it cool down quite enough, but I think it'll still do what I think it will. We will see in a few minutes. All right, so I'm going to let this cool off, and we're going to do a quick transfer. We're going to come back to this panel, and my edges are just about cool enough for me to scrape. So I'm going to use I have a couple of different types of scraping tools that I use. I don't have specific links for these, but they're pretty ubiquitously available at almost any art supply store. This is just a ceramic loop tool, and this is just a scraping tool that I think is made by Kemper. They do a lot of ceramic tools and supplies. So what I want to do is just very lightly scrape this edge. And I'm just reducing, this may be a little bit too subtle of a change to show on the camera, but I'm gonna put this close up so hopefully you can see it. My wax is still very warm, so I'm going through that layer of medium pretty quickly. So I use a very, very light pressure. And to just do the last little bit of very direct cleanup, I like to use the edge of the rounded scraper, because even though this looks like a huge giant scraper, and you can use this flat edge to really scrape the whole surface, this rounded edge is really great for getting into little detail areas. And my scraper is a little messy, so I'm leaving some streaks on there, so clean your tools before you try to do this. And I think that this is the clearest area that you can see. We've really reduced the amount of medium. A little bit more scraping there. This is a little bit of a delicate process. You can see on this spot that I overscraped and I went into my stenciled area, but on here, we've really reduced the amount of medium so that it's not obstructing our other layers the way that it is along this edge. So that's how you finish this type of stencil and just clean it up. What I really want to show you is a transfer. So we're going to do the transfer with pigment stick. And I want to just show a technique also that we call glazing. So this is an alizarin orange pigment stick. It's a very old pigment stick. So one of the things that can happen with your pigment sticks is you can get a pretty intense skin on them. So if you get that skin, just know that you can peel it off. And there are a couple ways that you can peel it off. If it's really thick like that, this stick is probably about 10 years old, because I use pigment sticks very sparingly in my work. You know, you can just remove it that way. If you have a stick that's a little fresher, let's see if that will come out. We have a question? 5 minutes. Oh my gosh. We can do it. You can rub it away as well. So now I have a lot of nice material that I can work with. And just for the sake of mentioning a safety factor with the pigment sticks, the pigment sticks themselves are very stable. So I'm just doing a little bit of glazing on this surface, which is really just using the pigment stick to color a very light layer over the encaustic paint. And I like to show this because it's a really fun way, especially with the translucent colors, to just play with picking up very fine little aspects of the surface and really getting that into little tiny crevices. So that was alizarin orange pigment stick, and this is just some Prussian blue. You want to do this with a lint-free rag, because now that's picking up all the lint in my rag, but it's still creating kind of a nice texture. So for the safety aspect, when you have rags in your studio that have pigment stick on them, you want to use the same kind of disposal method as you would for any other linseed oil rags. The pigment sticks are made with linseed oil. They are an oil paint. So you don't want to leave a linseed oil rag crumpled up in your studio like this. Because of the oxidation process, these can spontaneously combust. You would not have that happen with the pigment stick itself, because this is just a block of the paint. But because of the oxidation process makes the paint shrink in this rag, and that friction of the shrinking is what will cause the combustion. Oh my gosh, 2 minutes left. Okay, we're gonna do a quick transfer and a scrape, and then we're gonna be done. All right, so a little piece of parchment paper and a little bit of Prussian blue pigment stick. And figure out what to do with my roller. Normally, I would like to do this with a printing brayer, but of course I conveniently, oh, do you see it in there? Yeah, excellent. This is why it's great to have a technical assistant.
So you have a question about what to do with the rags, because I know we would put them in fire safe bins. What do you recommend people do with them?
Yeah, so I recommend that you use a metal can for storage and put a little bit of water in the bottom of the can, or at least you can also line the bag with a plastic, or line the can with a plastic bag, but put water in it. And then, you know, they can be disposed of in the garbage Just make sure that they're wet when you put them in. And don't store them in a location where they can really like cause damage. The other thing that you can do is if you lay them out flat or you put them on a clothesline to dry, that is another safe way to just make sure that they're inert and that they can't cause a combustion incident. Okay, so I have this nice layer of pigment sticks that I have rolled out onto a piece of parchment paper, very thin, not gooey at all. I'm gonna lay this down and I'm gonna not move it. And I'm just gonna take any kind of drawing utensil. This just happens to be a clay tool. I left myself a little bit of an unpainted area so that I could just hold down my parchment paper and keep it stable. And I get this really fun, interesting mark. And then to keep that mark, I'm going to go and fuse it in with the heat gun. You can do it, heat gun. You got this. And what I love about putting the pigment stick onto the encaustic surface and then fusing it is that it really deepens the color of the pigment stick because it's becoming wax saturated. Oh, you know what? I'm gonna scrape the thing real quick. And then, do we have any specific questions? I'm happy to hang around and a little bit longer if folks have more technical questions that they'd like to ask or questions about the material. So what I'm doing right now is just scraping back to bring out the stencil that I laid down before. So we're just scraping back some of that ultramarine blue pale. And revealing the stencil that we did in the red and the white. And we can do that over here on the medium side as well. And when I'm doing something like stenciling or another method that requires a lot of scraping, I try to hang on to and reuse as much of the paint as possible. In some cases, you can recycle a lot of good paint in one solid color. In some cases, you have to be prepared to have a little bit of a funky mixed color. But this is a really easy material to reclaim in comparison to other fluid types of paints. You can really get a lot of mileage out of this. So I'm not going to continue to scrape that too much more, but you can see how we're bringing the stencil back out. So we've got this nice layering of the stencil in this solid color. All right, I think we covered a lot. So thank you for coming and participating today. And again, as I mentioned, I don't know if we can unmute from there, Aaron, or if we can unmute from here. If anyone has questions that they would like to just ask, we're gonna see if we can unmute.
Well, that's
Oh, that's so. But under the settings, I think. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna see if I can unmute. Oh, but we lost a bunch of people. Okay. Which is totally fine. And yeah, so I'm just gonna, oh, well, if any, I think that I do not have control over it. If anyone would like to unmute, I think that you now have the option to do that. Oh, now you have the option to do that.
Yeah, I don't understand how to do it.
Yeah. So if anybody has questions, feel free to shout them out. Otherwise, we will end this meeting. All right, I'm not hearing any questions. So thanks again for participating, everyone that's still here. And hopefully we will see you for future events at Arlene's. I think so. I think we are.